The public has watched Simone Biles grow up in real time. For years, her life unfolded under bright lights, every routine analyzed, every expression scrutinized, every triumph and setback broadcast to the world. So when news broke that she had become a mother, and that her newborn daughter had finally been united with her father, Jonathan Owens, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. People called it beautiful. They called it tender. They called it a fairy tale moment. Social media filled with praise, tears, and declarations that this was the most wholesome story of the year. A legendary gymnast, a devoted husband, and a brand new life. On the surface, it felt like the perfect ending to a long, demanding chapter. But beneath that flawless image, something quieter was happening. The photos and videos released were serene to the point of feeling staged. Simone appeared calm, almost ethereal. Jonathan looked overwhelmed with emotion. The baby was swaddled delicately, as if every fold of fabric had been thoughtfully placed. It looked cinematic, too polished, too carefully framed. People cried watching it, convinced they were witnessing pure love frozen in time. Yet not everyone felt fully at ease. Some fans noticed what wasn't there. There were no lengthy explanations, no intimate interviews, no raw, unfiltered moments that usually follow such a life-changing announcement, especially from someone known for honesty and vulnerability. Instead, the public was given only fragments. Selected glimpses. A story told in whispers rather than full sentences. That absence raised quiet curiosity. Simone had never shied away from speaking openly about her struggles, her mental health, her pain, her battles behind the scenes. Her transparency had been one of the reasons people trusted her so deeply. This time, though, she said very little. At first, most people respected the silence. This was her family, her life. She didn't know anyone anything. But questions have a way of surfacing when silence lingers. Why did everything feel so tightly managed? Why did it seem like the world was allowed to see only what had been approved in advance? Slowly, fans began revisiting old interviews, lining up dates, rewatching past statements. Not out of malice, but confusion. They weren't accusing her of dishonesty. They just sensed something incomplete. The story didn't feel false. But it didn't feel fully uncovered either. And sometimes, the most intriguing truths live not in what's shown, but in what's carefully kept just out of view. Everything about it felt orchestrated. And that, more than anything else, is what set this moment apart. When most celebrities experience a life shift this big, a little disorder usually slips through, an unscripted comment, a messy emotion, a glimpse of overwhelm. Here, there was none of that. Not a crack. Not a tremor. Jonathan Owens became part of the conversation too. Yes, he appeared moved, but his quietness unsettled some viewers. He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer context or reflection. He simply existed within the frame, saying only what the camera allowed him to say. And in an era where people understand that cameras often tell a curated version of reality, that restraint felt noticeable. Instead of calming curiosity, the moment quietly intensified it. There was no uproar. No accusations. No headlines screaming scandal. Just a subtle sense that something important was being kept out of sight, like a door gently closed rather than slammed shut. And to understand why that silence felt so loud, people began retracing Simone's journey. Her life had never been simple. Long before fame, she endured instability, pressure, and the kind of childhood that forces strength to develop too early. She learned how to perform through pain, how to smile while carrying weight no child should have to bear. Survival wasn't optional, it was necessary. Years later, the world watched her confront Olympic expectations that became unbearable. When she spoke openly about her mental health, that honesty reshaped how people saw her. It wasn't just brave, it was rare. She had taught millions that vulnerability could coexist with greatness. Which is exactly why this new silence felt so unfamiliar. The woman who once explained her pain to the world was now offering almost nothing. As people looked closer, they noticed how precise everything seemed. The images were flawless. The timing was impeccable. The emotions were picture perfect. But real life, especially during moments of transformation, is usually uneven and unpredictable. Naturally, interpretations began to diverge. Some believed she was simply protecting her peace. Others suspected unseen pressure, emotional, personal, or situational. And then a quieter idea began to circulate, not loudly enough to accuse, but strongly enough to linger. What if this wasn't just a private milestone, but a narrative being gently shaped? No one was calling it untrue. They just felt it was incomplete. And that's how a heartwarming announcement slowly evolved into a puzzle. Not a dramatic one. Not a chaotic one. But a mystery built on absence rather than noise. The central question was disarmingly simple. If this moment was as organic and effortless as it appeared, why did it feel so meticulously arranged? By this point, the story had shifted. It was no longer only about a child meeting her father for the first time. It had become a conversation about visibility and restraint, about what the world was invited to witness and what it wasn't. About a woman who had spent her life mastering strength, perhaps still doing so in ways no one could easily recognize. And somewhere between the polished images and the deliberate quiet, a deeper narrative waited. As time passed, the curiosity didn't disappear, it grew heavier. Attention slowly moved from the baby announcement to Simone and Jonathan's relationship itself. From the outside, it had always seemed like a whirlwind romance. They met, fell hard, committed quickly, and built a life at remarkable speed. To many, it looked magical. But later, more people began saying the same thing in hushed tones. It all happened very fast. And in the celebrity world, speed often masks urgency. Urgency can mask pressure. And pressure, more often than not, hides fear. That realization didn't bring answers. But it made the questions impossible to ignore. Some longtime fans remembered Simone once saying that, after years of nonstop pressure, all she wanted was a quiet, steady life. Peace. Space to breathe. But that calm never truly arrived. Instead, life kept accelerating, one milestone stacked tightly on top of the next. A wedding. New responsibilities. Growing expectations. And then, pregnancy. No pause in between. That's where the tone of the story subtly shifted. A handful of people close to the situation, never speaking directly, never on record, hinted that this chapter wasn't as effortless as it appeared. Simone wasn't only carrying a child. She was carrying an identity that had followed her entire life. Simone Biles, the symbol, the role model, the unbreakable one. Strength wasn't just admired from her, it was expected. Jonathan, meanwhile, found himself under a spotlight he hadn't trained for. Before their relationship, his world was mostly limited to sports fans. Afterward, millions of strangers were suddenly analyzing his every expression. Some viewers saw a proud, supportive partner. Others sensed discomfort, a man still adjusting to being watched so closely. What stood out most to some wasn't what he said, but how little he said. He showed up, but he didn't always look at ease. Real life, after all, doesn't play out like a highlight reel. Simone was also stepping into unfamiliar territory. She wasn't just an athlete anymore, she was a wife, and soon, a mother. Those roles came with a different kind of vulnerability. For someone who had spent decades mastering control over her body, pregnancy introduced uncertainty she couldn't train away. And for a person wired for precision, that loss of control, even when natural, could be deeply unsettling. People began noticing a change. The Simone who once spoke openly about fear, pressure, and pain now shared far less of her inner world. The posts were shorter. The captions lighter. Smiles replaced reflection. And strangely, the brighter everything looked, the more some fans felt that something was being quietly held back. Not sadness, something more internal. Like a battle being fought privately, without witnesses. Then there was the pacing. Major life events were unfolding one after another, with barely a breath in between. It felt like watching a train in motion that never slowed down. Some wondered whether this speed was chosen, or imposed. Maybe no one was pushing them. Maybe no one was planning anything at all. But what was undeniable was the pressure surrounding both of them. Pressure to appear happy. Pressure to appear strong. Pressure to appear ready. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Simone, who had once stepped away from the Olympics to protect her mental health, was now stepping into the most demanding role of her life with very little public reflection. And that led people to ask a quiet but piercing question: was she truly at peace, or was she once again being strong for everyone else? By the time the baby arrived, the moment felt heavier than a simple celebration. It felt like the closing of a long, silent chapter, and the beginning of another one that no one could fully read yet. While the world cheered, something deeper remained hidden beneath the surface. After the birth, instead of clarity, there was even more restraint. The public saw only fragments, a few carefully chosen photos, a handful of emotional images, and then silence. People noticed the pattern almost immediately. Typically, moments like this come with interviews, personal reflections, long captions. This time, there was almost nothing. And paradoxically, the less Simone shared, the louder the conversation became. A new theory began to circulate, not loudly, but persistently. Maybe this wasn't only about privacy. Maybe it was also about presentation. Simone had always been surrounded by a powerful system, one that protected her career, shaped her narrative, and managed her public image. That structure had helped her survive a world that never stopped judging. And now, even her most intimate milestones seemed to move through that same careful filter. Fans started studying what had been shown. Everything appeared polished, serene, almost unreal. There were no signs of exhaustion, no visible fear, no cracks at all. And real life, especially after childbirth, is rarely that smooth. Some people said this was simply strength. Others believed the world was only being shown the safest version of the truth. Jonathan's silence returned to the center of the discussion. He was present. He was emotional. But he shared almost nothing about becoming a father, no reflections, no explanations, no sense of how his life had shifted. In a time when oversharing was the norm, that quiet created space for speculation. Then the timeline questions resurfaced. Old posts were revisited. Interviews replayed. Casual comments from years earlier were suddenly re-examined. Dates were lined up like puzzle pieces no one was officially meant to assemble, but everyone was staring at them anyway. Nothing, on its own, suggested wrongdoing. Yet when placed side by side, a subtle unease settled in. It felt as though everything had been timed with extraordinary care. In the world of fame, even joy can be scheduled, not out of coldness, but because survival often requires precision. Some began whispering that this wasn't just a personal milestone, but a narrative shift. A perfectly placed chapter in the evolution of Simone's public identity. Not only a champion, not only a survivor, but now, the image of composed, flawless motherhood. The timing felt symbolic. Almost cinematic. As if life itself had been edited and released at the exact right moment. Once that idea took hold, it was hard to unsee. It didn't mean there was no love. It didn't mean the child wasn't wanted, that would be unfair and untrue. It simply meant that their lives were unfolding under an overwhelming spotlight, one so intense it softened edges, erased messiness, and reshaped reality into something easier for the world to consume. And under that light, even the most genuine moments could start to look unreal. A spotlight that left no room for error. One that treated vulnerability as failure and punished imperfection, even when it was deeply human. Under that kind of gaze, joy came with conditions. Happiness had limits. And that's where curiosity quietly deepened. The more flawless everything appeared, the more people began wondering what had been deliberately excluded. Which moments never made the cut. Which emotions were toned down. Which fears, disagreements, or uncertainties were carefully kept off stage. Because often, the heart of a story lives not in what's shown, but in what's deliberately unseen. By this point, the conversation had grown beyond a single private milestone. It had become a reflection on control. On pressure. On the emotional cost of living as a symbol instead of simply as a person. One truth stood out clearly, heavy in its simplicity: when your life is constantly observed, even your happiest moments stop belonging solely to you. They become public property, filtered through headlines, expectations, opinions, and strangers who feel entitled to interpret them. And just when it seemed like that was the full picture, a deeper layer began to emerge. Behind the polished images and measured silence was a woman shaped long before she ever had the chance to define herself freely. Her body had been trained with precision. Her mind disciplined for performance. Her emotions regulated for survival. From an early age, excellence wasn't encouraged, it was required. Every smile was monitored. Every reaction examined. Every hesitation questioned. Over time, that kind of upbringing rewires how you experience your own life. You stop asking what you truly want and start asking what will be accepted, or what will cause the least disruption. In that context, motherhood wasn't just personal growth. It was a public transformation. People weren't only watching to celebrate, they were watching to evaluate. To see if she would be nurturing enough, resilient enough, balanced enough. Whether she would recover quickly enough. Whether she would live up to yet another ideal. The pressure didn't ease because the moment was sacred. If anything, it intensified. Because now she wasn't just representing herself, she was representing an image. There were subtle moments that told a quieter story. A glance that lingered too long. A smile that felt slightly restrained. A joy that seemed carefully contained. Those who had followed her journey closely noticed. Not because they craved drama, but because they recognized the signs of someone who had learned to carry heavy things in silence. Someone who understood that vulnerability, shown at the wrong time, could be costly. Gradually, the questions became more complex, less about curiosity, more about concern. What does it mean to raise a child in a life that has never known privacy? What does it feel like to realize your baby has a public presence before they can even speak? How do you protect something so fragile in a world that feels entitled to watch every step? These weren't questions she answered aloud. They simply existed around her, unspoken, persistent, familiar. There was also the quiet struggle of identity. For most of her life, she had been defined by achievement, by what she could do, what she could endure, what she could win. Motherhood, while deeply meaningful, also threatened to reshape that identity in ways that unsettled others more than it unsettled her. Would she still be the same? Would she still inspire the same way? Would she still fit the version of her the world had grown comfortable with? These were questions asked about her, often without regard for how invasive they truly were. What many people overlooked was how much she had already given. How many pieces of herself had been offered up to meet expectations. So when she stepped into this new chapter, it wasn't reckless or naive. It was layered, intentional, protective, and yes, possibly strategic. But intention didn't erase sincerity. Planning didn't cancel out love. It simply meant she understood the environment she was navigating. At some point, the focus shifted again. The story was no longer just about a baby, it became about ownership. Who controlled the narrative? Who had the right to define what this moment meant? Was it her and her family, or the public that had followed her for years? That tension lingered quietly beneath everything. And whether by instinct or design, she seemed to be walking a narrow line, sharing just enough to satisfy curiosity while holding back enough to protect what mattered. And then there was fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, constant fear of making a mistake that couldn't be undone. Of failing in a way that would be judged endlessly. Of being evaluated not as an athlete, but as a mother. Strength doesn't erase that fear. If anything, it sharpens it, because strong people know exactly how far there is to fall. In the end, what people were witnessing wasn't a perfectly engineered narrative. It was a woman navigating an impossible balance, loving deeply while being watched relentlessly. Growing while being scrutinized. Trying to claim her joy in a world that constantly tried to claim it for her. And all the questions, theories, and timelines said far more about the system surrounding her than about her heart or her intentions. And maybe that was the quiet truth beneath everything else. Simone's life, like the lives of so many people in the public eye, has always existed in two parallel worlds. One is the private reality she lives inside, filled with love, uncertainty, fear, and hope. The other is the version the world consumes, trimmed, interpreted, debated, and endlessly reshaped. The real tragedy was never that people questioned timelines or motives. It was that she was rarely given the grace of being left unquestioned at all. As this deeper layer came into view, it became clear that the story had never been only about image or control. It was about survival. About learning how to protect your inner world when millions feel entitled to it. About deciding what parts of your life are safe to share, and what must remain sacred. In that way, Simone wasn't just becoming a mother. She was redefining strength in a world where the cameras never blink. And that truth reached far beyond fame or public perception. When the noise finally softened, one reality weighed heavier than all the rumors combined. Simone Biles was never meant to be just a story, a symbol, or an idealized image. She was a human being who had carried extraordinary expectations from an impossibly young age. Long before medals and headlines, she learned how to survive. How to bury pain beneath discipline. How to appear unbreakable even when breaking felt inevitable. And habits formed in survival don't disappear just because life changes. So when people interpreted her silence after the baby's birth as strategy, they may not have been entirely wrong. But here's the part many didn't consider: some of that silence may have come from fear. Fear of being judged again. Fear of being seen as weak. Fear of losing control in front of a world that had never been gentle. Sometimes, even joy can feel overwhelming when your entire life has been shaped by pressure. Jonathan's quietness began to make more sense, too. He wasn't just adjusting to fatherhood, he was stepping into a life where privacy no longer existed. Where every moment could be dissected. Where even